Political Science 100. It's time to take on one of my favorite topics in the class and one of the areas that I, as a political scientist, specialize in and pay particularly close attention to, and that is public opinion, which is really what we the people know about politics. You probably will have picked up on the fact that over the course of this semester, I have railed at many times about the anti-democratic elements of the American political system, about the ways in which we don't really live up to the expectations of democracy in terms of minority rule that runs through many of our institutions and various aspects of democracy that seem designed, if anything, to limit mass input into policymaking. Me complaining about that, however, has merit only if there is some value in the opinion of the people. Democracy only works the way I seem to think it ought to, the way I want it to, rule by the people. It only works if the people actually know something about politics. And of course, it's not enough just to know something. You have to express those views through the political process, primarily through voting, which would be the topic of our next section. But if the people fail on either one of those counts, then you don't have much of a democracy. So this immediately begs the question, is the average American well informed about government and politics? And I'm going to switch here to a YouTube video to address that question.
Republicans in Congress have been hard at work looking to repeal and replace Obamacare right now. People have very strong opinions about the president's health care plan. And back in, I think in 2013, we conducted an experiment here on the show. We went on the street and we asked people which was better, Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, which, is anyone who knows anything about this subject at all knows, Obamacare is just a nickname for the Affordable Care Act. They're the same thing. So with all the attention being paid to the subject lately, we decided to ask this question again to see if Americans have learned anything over the last 3 years. And, well, let's see if we have.
We're talking to people about health care today.
Okay.
Do you support Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act?
Affordable Care Act.
And why is that?
Well, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Obama, so I don't support him in the Obama things that he's got going on. I'm actually really excited for President-elect Donald Trump, so.
Right. So you don't like anything Obama does, and you prefer the Affordable Care Act?
Absolutely.
Do you support Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act?
I support Obamacare.
So if you were a senator and you could vote today, you would vote to keep Obamacare instead of the Affordable Care Act?
Yes.
Do you support Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act?
I guess the Affordable Care Act.
And why do you prefer the Affordable Care Act over Obamacare?
I'm not really sure. My girlfriend supports Trump, so I go with whatever she says.
What is the main difference between Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act?
One is you pay, and then the other one is Obama pays for you.
Right, Obama pays, pretty big difference.
Pretty big difference.
What makes Obamacare better than the Affordable Care Act?
It's more affordable for the less fortunate, I'd say.
So Obamacare is more affordable than the Affordable Care Act?
I'd say it is.
I believe that Obamacare, the premiums are too high, so people end up paying more.
Right.
So I believe in the Affordable Care Act.
And so the Affordable Care Act is more affordable than Obamacare?
Right, correct.
Right.
Which is obvious based on the name.
It's in the name, right?
Right.
Why do you like the Affordable Care Act more than Obamacare?
Because I don't like Obama.
But you like the Affordable Care Act?
Yeah.
What if I told you Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act are the same thing? We're talking about health care with people out here today.
Tight.
Do you support Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act?
I'm kind of like... Can you repeat the question?
Sure, yeah. With health care, do you support Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act when it comes to health care?
I guess... Obama's pretty tight, so I guess I'd probably like Obama.
Sure.
Yeah.
How stoned are you right now?
Pretty stumped.
Right.
Wow. I've watched that dozens of times and it just never gets old. And remember here, Obamacare and first the effort to pass the legislation to make healthcare insurance more affordable and more available to about 40 million Americans was the primary legislative accomplishment of President Obama in his first term. It was hotly debated. It was the topic of discussion for most of Obama's first term. And then when President Trump came into office after 2 Obama terms, his effort to repeal Obamacare was again the major legislative effort. He failed by 1 vote in doing so, but it was the dominant topic of conversation in American politics. So how can you be so uninformed as to not know that the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare are the same thing? How out of touch do you have to be to not understand that basic fact about the dominant issue, one of the dominant issues in our politics? Now, how might you critique that video? You know, we saw an interview with, what were there, 4, 5, 6 people? It's entirely possible, I suppose, that Jimmy Kimmel's camera crew went down on Hollywood Boulevard and interviewed 100 people, most of whom gave perfectly reasonable answers to that question. And they showed us these clips from the 5 or 6 funniest ones, and because it makes for good television. So maybe that's possible. I would like to believe that, except that representative samples from actual surveys have found basically the same thing. At around the same time as the original Jimmy Kimmel Obamacare person on the street interview was made, CNBC did the exact same thing, again, in an actual survey with representative samples of people, so not just selectively cherry-picking funny people off the street, but actually going out to the American public and asking the question, which they support and which they oppose, Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. And in much the same way, actually in the actual surveys, Obama's name seemed to generate more hostility and more support simultaneously than the Affordable Care Act. All of that is insane. However you feel about one, you should feel about the other, because they're the same thing. But also that Obama could drive support for it, and his name could also drive opposition to it, as opposed to the Affordable Care Act, is another layer of crazy on the whole thing. And it doesn't stop there. This article from USA Today from about 10 years ago goes on and talks about other examples of polling evidence that we're pretty ignorant about politics. A Harris poll from the American Bar Association in 2005 found that 22% of respondents thought that the 3 branches of government were Republican, Democrat, and Independent. 2/3 of Americans couldn't name a single sitting Supreme Court justice in 2003, and fewer than 1% can name all 9. I'm actually shocked that it's even as high as 1% that can name all 9 justices. In 1987, about half of Americans thought that Karl Marx's dictum, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, was in the U.S. Constitution. That dictum is about communism. It's not in the Constitution. In 1964, only 38% of American people were certain that the Soviet Union wasn't in NATO, the International Defense Alliance created to combat the Soviet Union. There's not a whole lot of evidence that the American public knows much about politics and has any clue what's going on. People who do understand politics, and that would include government officials, the news media, scholars, analysts, those people understand politics. Their understanding of the landscape of politics, how things are arranged, is couched in terms of what we call an ideology. And I'm going to quote from the text here in terms of what ideology is and what the 2 dominant ideologies in American politics are today. In American politics today, liberals typically favor using government to reduce economic inequalities, champion the rights of disadvantaged groups such as racial minorities and women, and tolerate a more diverse range of social behaviors. They prefer a smaller defense establishment and are usually less willing to use military force in international politics. They believe the rich should be taxed at higher rates to finance social welfare programs. That's the liberals. That's on the left. That would be Democrats. Conservatives distrust government and have greater faith in private enterprise and free markets, but they are more willing to use government to enforce traditional moral standards. They favor a larger military and more assertive pursuit of national self-interest. Conservatives advocate lower taxes, particularly on investment income, to stimulate growth and to restrict the government's capacity to finance social welfare programs. That's a really good, even-handed, pretty comprehensive assessment of what it means to be a liberal in the United States and what it means to be a conservative in the United States. And most people who follow politics closely will get all of that. And we will we will organize our understanding of the political landscape along that continuum of left to right, liberal to conservative, Democrat to Republican. Sadly, among the public, that orientation doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They don't understand ideology. We, meaning political scientists who study public opinion, have been looking at this question, the level and depth of knowledge of people's understanding of politics ever since we've had good survey data, which goes back to the 1950s. And from the earliest studies of public opinion, one of the first findings that stood out was that people don't have an ideology. People don't really have any coherent philosophy that structures their political views. Extensive survey interviews in-depth interviews asking people to talk about their political attitudes and political issues and viewpoints found that maybe 4% of the public understood politics in a way that resembled people who had an ideology, an understanding of this left-right continuum. About another 12% seemed to come close to understanding terms of left and right and liberal and conservative, but not really, but close. By far the largest plurality in these findings were people who understood politics in terms of group benefits. They seemed to understand whether their particular group, however they defined it, whether they considered themselves to be part of labor or their socio-demographic groups or whatever group they most identified with, whether the current political environment advantaged their group or not. And then about a fifth of the public, according to these early surveys, really understood politics in no more depth than just in terms of the nature of the times. Do things seem better now or worse now than they were before? And I guess we'll credit or blame whichever party is in power accordingly. No understanding of any underlying reason for that, just to sort of stick your thumb in the air and how does it seem to be blowing? And then almost equal number of people, nearly a fifth, had no clue whatsoever. They had their discussion of politics was completely devoid of any sort of structural understanding at all. Other things we found, in addition to this lack of ideology, was a lack of consistency across issue positions. I guess it makes sense that if you don't have an ideology, if you don't understand liberal and conservative and points of view and find yourself in one camp or the other, you're going to be liberal on some things to conservative on other things. And not that that's necessarily bad. It's fine. I mean, it's fine to believe whatever you want, but it's not necessarily a violation of anything to have some views that are liberal and some that are conservative. But what's really interesting in these surveys is the lack of stability over time on issues. And that suggests something else. It's one thing if you seem to be conservative on some issues, maybe social issues, but you're liberal economically or the reverse, whatever. But when your views seem to ping pong back and forth, seem to fluctuate over time in a way that, there's only a couple things that happen. And by the way we understand this, the way we know that people's views fluctuate over time is through a type of survey where we would interview people at one time point and get their views, and then go back to those same exact people some period later, 6 months, a year, 2 years later, and ask them the same questions. And what we found repeatedly over time is that their answers would change. They would be liberal on abortion one time and then conservative on it the other day. They would have a conservative view on the role of government in the economy one time and then a liberal view the other day. And there's only a couple things that can logically explain this. One is that they spent a whole lot of time in deep thought, reading political philosophy, and had an evolution of their views. That's unlikely. The more likely view was they were just answering questions randomly at time A, and at time B, 6 months to a year later, didn't remember what they'd said at time A. It didn't mean anything to them then. It doesn't mean anything now. So they gave another answer, another random answer that was different. The behavior of the instability on these questions from time A to time B looks like random fluctuation, because it is. Meaning the opinions that were being offered weren't opinions at all. They were just answering survey questions to try and get the survey over. They don't know what they're talking about. These early studies of public opinion, and it's not just the early ones, it's up through today, generated extremely pessimistic assessments of the American public. U.S. citizens seem to fall well short of the expectations of democracy. And it's not all that hard to understand why that would be. We're back to a collective action problem. In terms of becoming informed as a public, you've got each individual citizen has to face the balance between the costs of becoming informed versus the benefits of becoming informed. It takes some work to be informed about politics, and there's a payoff for doing so. Well, let's think about those two things in tandem. The costs are pretty obvious. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes some finances. You have to have access to information, whether that be newspaper subscriptions or internet access or cable fees or whatever. In addition to all of that, there's the opportunity cost. There's what else you could have done with that time, that energy, that money. You probably have things you'd rather do than read up on politics. So you have to forego those things in order to become informed. Now, okay, so there's costs, but there are also benefits. The benefits of becoming informed are the ability to cast a more intelligent vote, to be a better informed democratic citizen, to have a better democracy. Okay, that's cool. But here's the thing. Intelligent votes don't count any more than ignorant votes do. I get one vote, and my one intelligent vote, assuming that it is, doesn't weigh any greater in the ultimate tally than in some random person's ignorant vote. And the better democracy we would hope for, your one intelligent vote doesn't provide it. To achieve a better democracy, we need millions of intelligent votes, not just yours. This better democracy that we would be striving for is in fact a non-excludable good. You can't deny the benefit of it to only those who help produce it. You can't let just the smart people live in this democracy. If we create this more intelligent, better democracy, it's there for all of us. So, what does that suggest? And by now in this class, you better be able to answer this question. Why not free ride? Why go to the trouble of becoming informed? You doing all that work, paying all those costs and the opportunity costs, it doesn't affect anything. Why not let everyone else do that work and you enjoy the benefit of the better democracy for free? Well, of course, if we all think that way, we don't ever get that benefit. Think about the payoff that is presented to you and the incentive structure that you face for doing homework or not doing homework in a couple of different decision scenarios. Suppose you're deciding on buying a new car, and then on the one hand, and on the other hand, deciding which presidential candidate to vote for. Which decision is worth researching? If you make a good choice in terms of which car to buy, you'll enjoy it immediately. And there will be a pretty strong correlation between the amount of homework you put into that and the quality of your decision. I recently bought a new car. I had a Honda that I drove into the ground, and so about a year ago, it was time to get a new one. And I spent a whole lot of time on Consumer Reports and watching videos and doing my background research and making a smart choice. And I made a good choice, and I'm very happy with it, and that choice stemmed right from that homework. Think about how much of a payoff you get, though, for investing in the research that is needed to cast a smart presidential vote. You get a future benefit, not one immediately. You don't get to drive your new president off the lot the way you do a new car. You get a future benefit, maybe, if your person wins. If not, you've just wasted your time. Also, that additional homework that you do, yes, it produces a better vote, but that's not the same as a better outcome, because your vote has statistically no effect on the outcome. You're one of hundreds of millions of votes. Is it really worth it in that sense then in terms of researching a new car, it's absolutely worth it. There's a direct payoff between the amount of homework you do, how informed your decision is, and what you get. But in terms of following politics, there's nowhere near that direct payoff. There's a word that social scientists have, a phrase that social scientists have coined that reflects this phenomenon. It's called rational ignorance. And both parts of that phrase, the rational and the ignorant, are pretty important. The ignorance we've established pretty well by now. Americans just don't know a whole lot about politics. But rather than dismiss that as somehow a failing on the part of the citizenry, this phrase reflects the fact that it's actually pretty rational. You don't have a whole lot of incentive to be informed. Free riding actually makes sense because there's so little payoff tied to your individual effort. An informed public in a better democracy takes the effort of millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people, not just you. So you're much better off just sitting back and letting the other hundreds of millions of people do that work, and you enjoy the benefit of a better informed democracy. Of course, the problem being that if enough of us think that way, we don't ever have that better democracy. Maybe the solution to all this is to not depend on the citizens in the first place. Maybe my ranting and raving all course long about the failings of American political institutions, American political processes to be more democratic, maybe I'm completely off base. And if you think that, you're certainly not alone. There's some pretty famous people who viewed democracy that way. They're called the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers were very elitist in their views on public opinion and on the role that the mass public ought to have in shaping public policy. And that is very much why they created the political system they did, designed specifically, as we talked about at the very beginning of this class, to mute the influence, to limit the influence of the masses in the policymaking process. Per the founders' way of thinking about politics, government was effective to the extent that it could depend on enlightened elites, not to the extent to which it was tied to the masses. In fact, the masses need to pretty much as possible stay out of the way. Think of leaving the chefs alone in the kitchen to do their work. Just don't bother them. That was pretty much the founders' idea about democracy. Here are some quotes of various founding fathers in terms of what they actually thought about literal democracy, real involvement on the part of people in the process. The founder of our Constitution, James Madison, said, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." John Adams, our second president, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." Thomas Jefferson, who had a way with words, "A democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the other rights of the 49%. Winston Churchill was not a founding father, but along the same lines, "The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter." So if you go back and you think about the things that we talked about early on in this class, the design of our political system, separate power, staggered terms of office, indirect selection of leaders, the establishment of courts that are not tied to the people at all. They're put into place by senators and presidents who were not, per the founders' design, elected in themselves, and justices who cannot be removed. All of those things are really about erecting barriers between average people and policymaking. That's the point of all of it, keeping the zombies away and out of power. One of the central overarching themes in the development of American political history has been to open up the process in ways the founders they're rolling over in their graves that we're doing this. We've expanded voting rights. The founders limited voting rights to white male property owners. The founders had in mind that the state legislatures should pick the senators, the U.S. senators from each state. We amended the Constitution so that now we, the people, directly elect the senators. We've even taken over the candidate nomination process. That used to be the purview of the political parties and party insiders, but now we have primary elections where average people like you and me can choose not just the general election winners, but the nominees themselves. And to make it way worse from the perspective of the founders, we, the people, have now established direct democracy, the initiative process, in about 3/4 of the states in the United States. This is the process where we have ballot initiatives that we, the people, through a signature signing process, petition process, can actually put on the ballot policy we can put on the ballot and then vote it up or down ourselves, completely circumventing, bypassing the entire legislative process, bypassing professional politicians entirely. The founding fathers would say this has been a huge mistake. Everything I've just laid out for you about the nature of public opinion and what the public knows, I would characterize as the pessimistic case against public opinion in American politics. I'm going to take a break here and now develop the optimistic case. I'm going to argue against everything I just said. And that's going to take us to, at one point I would have left it there and I would have walked away feeling pretty good about the mass public and about the ability of average people to live up to the expectations of democracy. However, in about the last 10 years or so, there's been yet another development on this front that has me flip-flopping back to my more negative assessments. So I'm going to take a break here, and we'll come back and we'll do the second half of public opinion.